The air inside the main lodge office smelled of old pine dust, damp wool, and the bitter, metallic tang of cold brass keys hanging in absolute, unyielding rows against the cedarwood wall. My name is Richard. Tell me, have you ever sat entirely alone in a massive, shuttered mountain resort buried deep under feet of heavy Sierra Nevada snow at midnight, knowing that every single door for miles around can be opened with a simple turn of a wrist? Most people think isolation is just a quiet place where nobody bothers you. They imagine a peaceful retreat in the pines, a cozy room where you can listen to the wind whistle through the eaves and enjoy the comforting silence of the wilderness. They don't know what it's like to work a night shift guarding an empty resort that has been completely sealed off from the outside world by a relentless winter blizzard. They don't know about the master board. Have you ever asked yourself why a young man with his whole life ahead of him would willingly take a solitary maintenance job at a dead-season mountain lodge where the power lines fail every time the wind blows from the west? Let me tell you. It isn't because of the pay, which barely covers the cost of instant coffee and canned soup. It's because when you are trying to escape a past that followed you all the way across the country, a remote outpost where nobody ever comes looking for you feels like the safest cage in the world. At least, it does until the keys start moving on their own. Tonight was my shift at the Pinecrest Summit Resort. A sprawling complex of wooden cabins, luxury suites, and administrative buildings perched on a steep mountain ridge, currently locked down and empty except for me. My job was entirely administrative and maintenance-based. Keep the wood pellet furnace roaring in the basement so the main water pipes didn't freeze and burst. Inspect the emergency equipment logs every 2 hours. And maintain the massive, wall-mounted brass key cabinet, a heavy oak board containing hundreds of old, notched metal keys, each stamped with a specific cabin or room number, hanging from tiny iron hooks. My fingers were stiff, dry, and cold as I sat at the wooden desk, staring down at the master logbook while the storm outside battered the thick glass windows like a swarm of angry ghosts. The wind shrieked through the canyon, driving a blinding wall of white snow against the lodge siding until the entire structure groaned on its stone foundation. I reached for my coffee mug, my hand pausing halfway across the desk. And then, right in the middle of the howling gale, from the dark, wood-paneled hallway outside the office door, I heard the slow, measured sound of a single pair of heavy boots walking deliberately across the floorboards. Have you ever experienced that sudden, terrifying drop in the pit of your stomach when you realize you are not as alone as you convinced yourself you were? People always talk about fear as a mental state, a passing emotion that you can logic your way out of if you just take a deep breath and think rationally. They imagine themselves staying calm, assessing the variables, and executing a brilliant escape plan with cool, cinematic precision. They don't understand the crushing physiological reality of paralyzing terror. They don't know what it feels like when your blood turns to ice water, your lungs refuse to expand, and every muscle in your body locks up tight, leaving you stranded in your own skin like a statue made of salt. I sat completely frozen at the wooden desk, my breathing shallow and ragged, staring directly at the polished brass handle of the office door. The resort was closed. The access roads were buried under 10 feet of packed snow and avalanche debris. There were no guests, no staff members, and no maintenance crews scheduled to arrive for another 2 months until the spring thaw opened the mountain passes. Yet someone was walking down the hallway in the dead of night, moving with an unhurried, chilling confidence that suggested they owned the entire property. Think about how fragile our sense of security really is when we are cornered in an unfamiliar place with no backup and no way out. We build our lives around routines, schedules, and the quiet comfort of 4 walls, convinced that we are the masters of our own domain. We trust in locks, bolts, and heavy wooden doors to keep the dark things outside where they belong. Then a strange set of footsteps echoes through an empty corridor in the middle of a blizzard, and you realize that every single wall we build is just a temporary cage waiting for someone to find the key. The heavy, measured footsteps in the dark hallway outside the administration office continued their slow, rhythmic march, pausing for a brief second outside the locked doors of the vacant guest suites before moving steadily closer to my desk to claim my life. My heart hammered against my ribs with a frantic, punishing rhythm that echoed in my ears like a drumbeat inside an empty vault, fracturing my chest wall from within with brutal, unrelenting force. Have you ever sat entirely alone in a dark room at midnight, listening to an approaching presence while every instinct in your body screams that you have nowhere left to run and the Reaper is waiting? People always talk about fear as a temporary spike in adrenaline that sharpens your senses and prepares you for heroic action. They imagine themselves moving with lightning speed, effortlessly unlocking doors, grabbing weapons, and outsmarting any threat that dares cross their path. They don't understand the paralyzing weight of absolute dread that suffocates every breath. They don't know what it feels like when your blood turns to ice, your fingers refuse to grip anything, and your mind completely blanks out, leaving you trapped inside a body that has suddenly forgotten how to move while terror tears your sanity apart. I forced my rigid legs to slide backward, the wooden legs of my chair scraping softly against the floorboards as I pulled myself away from the desk in a blind panic. My eyes darted frantically across the dim office, searching for any possible escape, any hidden exit, or any heavy object I could use to barricade the heavy oak door against the slaughter. There was the single wall-mounted telephone, an old rotary instrument wired directly to the regional switchboard down in the valley. If I could reach it, if the lines hadn't snapped under the weight of the ice, I could call for help before the blade found my throat. I scrambled across the room, my boots nearly slipping on the braided rug, and grabbed the black receiver off its heavy metal cradle, pressing it desperately against my ear with shaking hands. Think about how completely dependent we are on the invisible threads of communication that tie us to the rest of the world. We pick up a phone and expect a steady, comforting hum of electricity. We trust that a voice will answer, that assistance is only a few numbers away, and that civilization is just a short conversation distance from our current location. Then you bring the receiver to your ear and find only a dead, hollow silence, devoid of any static, any dial tone, or any sign of life, leaving you entirely abandoned to the dark. There was no sound at all. Not even the faint electrical hiss of a working line. The heavy copper cables strung across the mountain pass had finally snapped under the weight of the blizzard, cutting off the last remaining lifeline between Pinecrest Summit Resort and the outside world, sealing my doom. I stood there in the dark office, holding a dead piece of plastic and metal, listening to the hollow echo of my own ragged, dying breathing inside the receiver. And then, right from the master key cabinet mounted on the cedar wood wall beside the desk, a sudden, sharp metallic sound cut through the silence of the room like a razor blade slicing the air. Clink. A single brass key, stamped with the number 304, trembled on its iron hook, swung back and forth by an invisible, malevolent vibration, and dropped completely off the board, hitting the wooden floor with a hollow, echoing clatter that signaled my time had run out. The small brass key stamped with the number 304 lay on the dark wooden floorboards, its polished metal edges catching the pale, ghostly light of the winter storm outside the frosted window like a mocking eye. My eyes remained locked on the empty iron hook above the masterboard, my breath catching in my throat as the hollow echo of the falling key faded into the howling silence of the administration office, leaving a suffocating void in my chest that threatened to rupture my lungs. Have you ever stared at a motionless object in an empty room, convinced that it moved entirely on its own while your back was turned to drag you closer to your doom? People always rely on physical logic to explain the strange occurrences in their environment, searching for drafts, vibrations, or settling foundations to rationalize the unexplained as terror grips their spine. They imagine themselves staying cool and analytical, dismissing every creepy sound or fallen item as a trick of the wind or an old building settling into the ground. They don't understand the psychological erosion that happens when the physical laws of your surroundings begin to break down one piece at a time, tearing your sanity to bloody shreds. They don't know what it feels like when your mind finally accepts that there is no rational explanation left, and that whatever is happening in the dark is deliberate, focused, malicious, and directed entirely at carving your flesh apart. I didn't reach down to pick up the key. My boots remained rooted to the floorboards as I stared at the cedarwood board containing hundreds of other notched metal keys, each hanging quietly in its designated slot like silent victims awaiting slaughter. Room 301. Room 302. Room 303. And now, space 304 stood completely bare, its iron hook gleaming empty against the dark grain of the wood like an open wound. The heavy, measured footsteps out in the long wooden hallway paused with chilling intent. Just outside the solid oak door of the administration office, the pacing stopped dead in its tracks to seal my fate in blood. Think about how terrifying it is to realize that an adversary isn't trying to hide their presence from you anymore as they come to tear you limb from limb. We walk through life expecting predators to strike from the shadows, relying on surprise, stealth, and darkness to achieve their goals. We prepare ourselves for sudden ambushes and hidden attacks, keeping our eyes peeled for movement in the dark corners of the room. Then the footsteps stop right outside your door, and you realize they want you to know they are there to watch you writhe in absolute panic. They want you to listen to every second of preparation, drowning in your own terror. They want you to hear the exact moment they decide to select your room from the board for execution. A soft, metallic scrape cut through the howling roar of the mountain blizzard like a razor blade slicing the flesh. It was the unmistakable sound of a heavy key being inspected, turned over between thick, calloused fingers, and aligned with the precision of a sadistic master craftsman ready to spill blood. The trap maker was standing in the dark hallway just inches from my door, breathing down my neck. He didn't have to guess which room I was hiding in to slaughter me. He didn't have to waste time testing random locks with a heavy crowbar or a sledgehammer to smash my bones. He had the master board. He had the keys to every single lock in the entire resort, hanging right here on the wall, and now he had retrieved the exact key that fit the administrative office lock cylinder to drag me into hell. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the freedom to hold an object, turn a handle, or brace a door against the night before the butcher arrives. How long do you think those fingers will remain steady when the lock begins to turn and the wood starts to give way under the weight of the axe? We are all just temporary night watchmen guarding an empty building at the edge of a world that stopped caring a long time ago, waiting for the blade to drop. The key slid into the exterior keyhole of the office door with a quiet, chilling click that echoed like a death knell in my ears. The brass key slid deep into the outer lock cylinder of the administration office door with a quiet, frictionless glide that bespoke years of careful oiling and maintenance, cutting through the heavy silence like a razor blade slicing open a fresh wound. My hands hovered in the freezing air of the room, trembling so violently and uncontrollably that my fingers felt completely disconnected from the rest of my body, leaving me utterly paralyzed as absolute terror flooded my veins with ice. Have you ever stood entirely alone in a dark room, listening to a sound so definitive and precise that it instantly strips away every lingering hope of escape, leaving your soul completely naked before the executioner? People always talk about fighting for survival as if human beings possess an endless reserve of heroic courage that surfaces the moment a crisis reaches its peak and the reaper approaches. They imagine themselves diving behind furniture, springing into action, and outsmarting an intruder with clever maneuvers and split-second reflexes as adrenaline pumps through their veins. They don't understand the crushing, physical reality of absolute dread that suffocates every breath. They don't know what it feels like when your knees turn to water, your breath freezes in your throat like shards of glass, and your entire existence shrinks down to the microscopic space where a piece of notched metal meets a set of internal brass tumblers, sealing your doom in a pool of agony. Outside the heavy oak door, the unknown man paused for a fraction of a second, breathing softly against the wood as he savored my rising panic. He didn't rush. He didn't throw his weight against the wood or rattle the handle in a frenzy of impatient violence, preferring to torture me with anticipation. He operated with the cold, unhurried precision of a master craftsman who had spent a lifetime practicing his trade in the darkest, blood-soaked corners of the world. A slow, deliberate rotation of the wrist, calculated to tear my sanity apart piece by piece. Click. The first internal tumbler fell into place with a sharp, distinct chime that vibrated straight through the dense cedar panels and into the palms of my hands like an electric shock of pure horror. Think about how foolishly we trust in simple barriers like wooden doors, deadbolts, and brass locks to protect us from the predators of the earth who crave our flesh. We turn a key in the morning, slide a bolt into place at night, and walk away feeling secure in our little boxes, convinced that a piece of treated timber and a cast iron plate can hold back a human being who has dedicated his entire existence to breaking boundaries and spilling blood. We assume that civilization is a permanent wall keeping the dark things at bay from our throats. Then an escaped serial killer walks up to your office door with a master key in his hand, and you realize that a locked door is nothing more than a wooden coffin waiting for a lid to be nailed shut over your living, screaming body. I backed away from the desk, my work boots sliding silently across the worn floorboards until the back of my knees struck the heavy edge of the filing cabinets, trapping me against the cold metal. My eyes darted frantically around the dim, shadow-filled room, searching for any possible weapon, any heavy tool, or any heavy furniture I could use to block the entrance before the second tumbler fell and the butcher stepped inside to carve me open. There was the heavy oak desk chair. There was the cast iron stapler. And there was the thick, industrial steel security chain bolted directly into the interior doorframe, a backup measure installed for severe mountain storms when rioting or trespassing became a lethal threat. The chain was short, thick, and made of hardened alloy links designed to withstand brute force. If I could reach it, if I could hook it into the bracket before the door swung open to reveal the nightmare, I might just buy myself enough time to find another way out of this slaughterhouse. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the freedom to hold a tool, turn a handle, or brace a door against the night before the killer arrives to sever your fingers. How long do you think those fingers will remain steady when the lock turns all the way and the wood begins to splinter under the weight of the axe? We are all just temporary night watchmen guarding an empty building at the edge of a world that stopped caring a long time ago, waiting for the blade to drop in blood and darkness. Click. The second tumbler fell with a sickening metallic resonance. The brass key completed its full rotation inside the lock cylinder, retracting the heavy deadbolt from its iron strike plate with a soft, final thud that echoed like a death knell inside my shattered skull. The final tumbler slid home with a dull, muffled thud, and the heavy oak door gave a fraction of an inch as the internal spring latch retracted entirely into its brass housing. My boots scrambled across the wooden floorboards, my arms reaching out wildly in the dim, shadow-filled office as I lunged toward the back of the door just as the polished brass handle began to rotate from the outside. Have you ever experienced a moment where every single second stretches out into an agonizingly long eternity, as if time itself had frozen out of sheer pity for your impending doom? People always talk about split-second reactions as if a human being can operate like a machine when a crisis hits its critical breaking point. They watch fictional dramas where characters effortlessly throw heavy barricades into place, sprint down escape corridors, and outsmart ruthless killers with a clever trick up their sleeve. They don't know the suffocating reality of absolute, unadulterated panic. They don't know what it feels like when your knees turn to water, your chest locks tight, and your brain simply stalls out, leaving you standing frozen in the middle of a catastrophe like a deer trapped in the blinding headlights of an oncoming freight train. My trembling fingers wrapped around the cold, thick loop of the industrial steel security chain bolted deep into the interior cedar frame of the office wall. The chain was short, heavy, and made of hardened alloy links designed to withstand the brutal force of mountain gales trying to rip the doors off their hinges during the worst winter storms. With a frantic, gasping heave, I pulled the sliding metal link across the gap, guiding its notched end desperately into the wall-mounted iron slot just as the exterior door swung inward. Clang! The heavy oak door slammed violently against the taut steel chain, stopping abruptly with a bone-rattling metallic shock that vibrated straight through the timber frame and up into my shoulders. Think about how foolishly we trust in simple barriers like security chains, door brackets, and flimsy latches to protect us from the predators of the world. We slide a piece of hardened metal into a slot, step back, and walk away feeling secure in our little boxes, convinced that a cast iron link can hold back the raw, primal violence of a human being who has nothing left to lose and everything to gain from your destruction. We assume that a physical barrier is a permanent wall keeping the dark things at bay. Then an escaped psychopath puts his weight against the other side of that door, and you realize that a security chain is nothing more than a thin wire holding back an avalanche. Through the narrow 4-inch gap between the door edge and the wooden jamb, the pale, flickering light of the hallway cut into the dark office like a knife blade. I pressed my entire body weight against the heavy wood, my boots sliding slightly on the smooth floorboards, holding my breath as I stared into the narrow opening. For a second, there was complete silence. No movement. No breathing. Just the howling roar of the mountain blizzard raging against the exterior walls of the resort. And then, slowly, a face appeared in the gap. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the freedom to hold a tool, turn a handle, or bar a door against the night. How long do you think those fingers will remain steady when the barrier begins to strain and the screws start tearing out of the wood? We are all just temporary night watchmen guarding an empty building at the edge of a world that stopped caring a long time ago. A pair of cold, unblinking eyes peered through the narrow opening from the dark hallway, fixing directly upon mine with an unsettling, clinical curiosity. The trap maker didn't shout. He didn't curse or try to force his way through the chain with brute violence. Instead, a slow, thin smile crept across his scarred face as he raised a gloved hand and gently tapped his index finger against the taut steel link holding his entry at bay. The gloved index finger tapped against the taut steel security link once, twice, 3 times, producing a sharp metallic ping echoing through the narrow gap of the heavy oak door like a death knell ticking down the seconds until my throat was torn open. My spine pressed flat against the splintered wood, my boots sliding slightly on the floorboards in a pool of sweat while my arms burned with the unbearable strain of holding my position against a force threatening to crush the life out of me. Have you ever stared directly into the eyes of a predator who is in no rush to finish the hunt, savoring every second of your mounting terror as your blood runs cold and your sanity shatters? People talk about life-or-death confrontations as fast-paced action sequences where punches are thrown, weapons drawn, and conflict resolves in a blur. They imagine themselves trading witty remarks and turning the tables with a brilliant stroke of tactical genius. They don't understand the psychological slow motion of a helpless situation where suffocation is guaranteed. They don't know what it feels like when time stretches out like melting wax, leaving you trapped in an agonizing vacuum of pure horror where every heartbeat feels like an eternity of pain and every breath is a luxury you might not get before the blade slices your windpipe. Through the narrow opening between the door and the jamb, the trap maker's face remained fixed on mine with an expression of cold, clinical detachment, a mask of pure evil looking down upon its helpless prey. He didn't look like a mindless animal driven by blind rage or feral instinct. He looked like a cold-blooded butcher inspecting hanging meat, evaluating its structural integrity before deciding which surgical tool to use next to carve me to pieces. "You found the chain, kid," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry pine needles scraping across concrete in an empty basement, dripping with malicious mockery. "Smart move." Most night watchmen panic and try to run out the back window into a snowdrift, only to freeze while begging for mercy. He paused, tilting his head as his dark eyes scanned the interior of the dark office behind me like a demon searching for a soul to devour. "They always freeze to death before they reach the road," he continued, a chilling chuckle rumbling deep within his chest, sending a wave of nausea up my throat. "At least you picked a spot to stay warm for a few minutes before I bleed you dry. Think about how much energy we waste trying to delay the inevitable, building elaborate barricades out of rules and physical objects to keep fears at bay while the Grim Reaper waits outside. We surround ourselves with security systems and locked gates, convinced we can engineer a barrier thick enough to keep mortality outside. We walk around with our chests puffed out, believing caution makes us masters of destiny. Then a man with a master key and a rusted blade stands on the other side of your door, and you realize every wall you built was just a fragile illusion waiting to collapse and spill your life across the floor. I didn't answer him. My voice was locked tight behind my ribs, buried beneath an avalanche of pure panic that paralyzed my tongue. I just stared back, my hands gripping the hardened steel link so hard my knuckles turned white and the skin split open, praying the screws holding the wall bracket would stay seated in the cedar wood as pressure mounted. The trap maker slowly withdrew his face from the gap. For a brief, terrifying second, the hallway went dark and quiet, a deceptive calm before the slaughter. I thought for a wild, desperate moment that maybe he had given up, that the heavy chain had discouraged him, and that he was turning to walk back down the long corridor. Then I heard a low, metallic scraping sound coming from the floor right outside the threshold, signaling the arrival of true horror. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have freedom to hold an object, turn a handle, or bar a door against the night before the butcher comes to sever your fingers. How long do you think those fingers will remain steady when the adversary changes tactics and decides to dismantle your sanctuary with violent, bone-shattering force? We are all just temporary night watchmen guarding an empty building at the edge of a world that stopped caring, waiting for the final execution. The scraping sound stopped. And a heavy, iron-tipped crowbar slid smoothly through the gap, resting its flat head directly against the interior wooden frame right above the security chain bracket, ready to shatter the wood and plunge me into an eternal nightmare of blood and agony. The flat, wedge-shaped head of the iron crowbar rested against the aged cedar wood frame of the office door, positioned with terrifying, surgical precision directly above the mounting screws of the security chain bracket to butcher me. My palms burned, the cold steel links biting deep into my bleeding, calloused skin while my entire body weight strained against the interior panels to keep the barrier from shifting as terror choked the breath from my lungs. Have you ever watched an immovable object slowly give way under an irresistible force, knowing that every fiber of your being is powerless to stop the descent into absolute slaughter? People always talk about structural resilience as if wood, iron, and steel possess an eternal strength capable of weathering any storm or defending against any assault. They imagine themselves leaning against a heavy barrier with unwavering determination, holding the line against the darkness through sheer grit and willpower. They don't understand the brittle, unforgiving nature of dead timber under extreme mechanical leverage as it tears apart. They don't know what it feels like when the wood begins to groan in agony, the mounting screws start to squeal as they are violently ripped sideways out of their pilot holes, and you realize that physical matter has a strict limit to how much agony it can endure before it snaps and spills your life. Outside in the narrow gap, the trap maker applied steady, downward pressure on the long handle of the iron crowbar with agonizingly cruel intent. There was no frantic swinging, no wild shouting, and no desperate display of brute strength. He operated with the quiet, methodical patience of an executioner dismantling a wooden crate on a slaughterhouse floor. Creak, snap. The sound was small at first, the sharp, high-pitched fracture of dry cedar fibers giving way under the immense mechanical advantage of the steel wedge like breaking bones. A fine cloud of pale wood dust drifted down from the doorframe, settling onto my shoulders and the back of my hands like gray winter snow mixed with the ashes of my fading hope. Think about how much of our lives we spend investing our security in inanimate things, houses built of pine boards, locks forged from cheap brass, and boundaries drawn on fragile maps. We walk through our daily routines wrapped in the comforting illusion that our homes are fortresses, that our doors will always hold, and that the savage chaos of the world can never cross our threshold to rip us apart. We trust in the permanence of walls. Then a man slides a crowbar into your doorframe, and you realize that civilization is just a thin layer of varnish over a rotting forest, ready to splinter the moment someone applies enough pressure to expose your naked flesh to the blade. You built a solid anchor, kid, the trap maker rasped from the hallway, his voice carrying a calm, conversational tone that cut straight through the howling roar of the blizzard outside like a knife through soft tissue. I'll give you that. Most kids wouldn't have thought to hook the chain before the second turn of the deadbolt. He paused, shifting his weight against the handle of the crowbar with sadistic pleasure. Trouble is, he continued, a cold, dry chuckle rattling in his blood-soaked throat, pine wood doesn't hold steel very well when the temperature drops below freezing. The fibers crystallize. They get brittle. Like human bone under a hammer. Crack. The sound was louder this time, a deep, tearing groan that echoed straight through the core of the administration office like a death rattle. The top screw of the security chain bracket pulled completely free from the wood frame, tilting the entire iron mounting plate forward by a half-inch and leaving a dark, gaping split in the cedar that wept fresh splinters. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the freedom to hold a tool, turn a handle, or brace a door against the night before the butcher arrives. How long do you think those fingers will remain steady when the last screw gives out and the barrier collapses entirely to let the nightmare in? We are all just temporary night watchmen guarding an empty building at the edge of a world that stopped caring a long time ago, waiting for the executioner's blow. I braced my boots harder against the worn floorboards, throwing my shoulder forward against the vibrating wood in a desperate frenzy, but it was already too late. Another steady push on the crowbar, and the entire assembly tore away from the frame with a sharp, violent crash of splintered timber and flying metal, exposing my throat to the dark. The security chain bracket tore completely out of the aged cedar frame with a sharp, violent, skull-fracturing shriek of splintering timber and snapping metal screws that pierced the air like a dying scream. The heavy oak door swung inward instantly, released from its final restraint, slamming against the interior wall with a thunderous, bone-rattling echo that shook the dust and rotting plaster from the ceiling rafters as my heart skipped a terrified beat. Have you ever experienced that sudden, absolute drop in your chest when every defensive barrier you spent precious seconds building collapses into ruin right before your eyes, exposing your flesh to the butcher? People always talk about fallback plans as if a human being can effortlessly transition from one clever tactical defense to another when the primary line fails and death is at the door. They imagine themselves executing a graceful tactical retreat, leaping over desks, and drawing a hidden weapon with cool, collected precision as adrenaline surges. They don't understand the paralyzing, suffocating shock of total exposure. They don't know what it feels like when your mind freezes in absolute disbelief, your arms drop uselessly to your sides, and you realize that the illusion of safety has completely vanished, leaving you entirely naked, bleeding, and defenseless in the dark. I stumbled backward, my boots tangling briefly in the edge of the braided rug before I caught my balance against the heavy oak filing cabinet, slamming my spine against the sharp metal edges. My breath came in short, ragged, burning gasps that scorched my throat like raw acid in the freezing air of the room. Standing in the newly widened doorway, framed by the pale, eerie luminescence of the blizzard raging in the hallway, was the trap maker, a demon stepping out of a nightmare. He didn't rush into the room to finish me quickly. He stepped across the threshold with the slow, deliberate, agonizing pace of a man taking a leisurely evening stroll through a slaughterhouse. In his right hand, he held the heavy iron crowbar loosely by its shaft, the flat wedge tip dripping with fresh blood and dragging slightly across the worn wooden floorboards with a soft, grating, sickening hiss that set my teeth on edge and made my stomach violently churn. His face was shadowed, cast in deep relief by the pale ambient light, but I could clearly see the cold, calculating, sadistic smile stretched thin across his scarred mouth, hungry for my pain. Think about how much of our lives we spend convincing ourselves that we are prepared for the worst, that we have contingencies for every possible disaster life can throw our way before the end arrives. We buy insurance, we install deadbolts, we store extra supplies, and we construct elaborate mental frameworks to keep anxiety at bay in our fragile little worlds. We walk around with our heads held high, acting as if our careful preparations make us immune to the chaos lurking in the margins of the world. Then a man steps through your broken door with a crowbar and murder in his eyes, and you realize that all your preparation was nothing more than a child building a castle out of dry autumn leaves ready to be crushed. End of the line, Richard, the trap maker said softly, his raspy voice carrying a chilling, lethal sense of finality that echoed off the cedar paneling like a death sentence. He stopped 5 feet away from me, planting his heavy work boots firmly on the blood-spattered floorboards and raising the iron crowbar just a few inches to ready the crushing blow. You kept me out for almost 3 minutes, he continued, tilting his head with a mock expression of professional appreciation while his eyes burned into my soul. "That's better than the last guy at the South Lodge." He didn't even remember to hook the chain before he hid under the desk, and I carved him like a pig. My eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for anything, a heavy stapler, a pair of scissors, a shard of broken glass, anything I could use to defend my throat against the impending, bone-shattering strike. There was nothing within arm's reach except the smooth, polished surface of the oak desk and the cold metal handles of the filing cabinet, sealing my doom. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the freedom to move them, to grip an object, or to reach out and touch someone you love before the blade falls. How long do you think those fingers will remain your own once the final corner is reached and the shadows close in to tear you apart? We are all just temporary night watchmen guarding an empty building at the edge of a world that stopped caring a long time ago, waiting for the executioner. The trap maker raised his arm higher, the heavy iron crowbar catching a stray glint of light from the storm outside as he prepared to bring it down straight through my skull. The heavy iron crowbar hissed through the freezing air of the administration office with a terrifying, whispering velocity, aimed in a clean, ruthless arc straight toward my chest to crush my ribcage into a bloody pulp. My muscles locked up entirely, every fiber of my being paralyzed by the absolute proximity of the strike before a desperate, animal survival instinct tore my body sideways in a frantic bid to avoid execution. Have you ever experienced that fraction of a second where time stretches so thin that you can actually perceive the mechanical physics of your own impending destruction, tasting copper and ash as your life flashes before your eyes? People always talk about dodging danger as if human beings possess the reflexes of trained acrobats, gracefully pirouetting out of harm's way when a lethal threat comes down upon them. They imagine themselves executing lightning-fast counterattacks, ducking beneath swings, and turning the tables with effortless physical dominance in a choreographed ballet of survival. They don't understand the clumsy, desperate, agonizing reality of close-quarters terror that robs you of your motor skills. They don't know what it feels like when your limbs weigh 1,000 pounds, your joints refuse to bend properly, and every movement feels like dragging yourself through thick, freezing mud while a heavy iron bar descends toward your ribs to shatter your soul. I threw my weight violently to the left, slipping past the corner of the heavy oak desk just as the flat wedge tip of the crowbar smashed into the wood with bone-splintering force. Crack. The impact was deafening in the small, enclosed space, echoing like a gunshot through my skull. The solid oak desktop splintered instantly, with chips flying like shrapnel in all directions as the iron bar punched straight through the thick timber surface, burying itself deep into the core of the structure like an axe biting into a cedar stump to carve me open. The trap maker grunted a low, feral sound of frustration, his feet shifting on the floorboards as he tried to yank the wedged tool back out of the ruined desk, his thick arms straining against the trapped metal with veins bulging. This was my only window to cheat the grave. Think about how much of our lives we spend waiting for permission to fight back, hesitating until the trap has already snapped shut around our ankles and our blood is ready to spill. We wait for ideal conditions, for fair fights, for someone else to step in and handle the heavy lifting while we stand safely on the sidelines hoping for a peaceful resolution that never comes. We forget that survival doesn't care about rules, fairness, or clean execution, demanding absolute savagery in return. Then you find your enemy stuck in a piece of furniture, and you realize that every second of hesitation is just another nail driven into your own coffin as the butcher prepares to skin you alive. I didn't think. I didn't look for a weapon or calculate the odds of my own survival against a monster. I lunged forward with blind fury, slamming both of my hands squarely against the trapmaker's chest with all the accumulated terror, rage, and adrenaline burning inside my frame, tearing my own muscles in the process. The sudden shove caught him entirely off balance while his arms were still locked forward, struggling to dislodge the crowbar from the splintered oak in a moment of blinding vulnerability. He stumbled backward, his boots skidding across the smooth floorboards over the scattered with chips and slick blood. With a sharp, gasping wheeze of shock, he lost his footing completely and crashed heavily against the wall-mounted brass key cabinet, shattering the wood. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the freedom to push, to strike, or to build something before the dark takes over and tears your flesh from your bones. How long do you think those fingers will remain steady once the tables turn and the hunter catches his breath to slaughter you? We are all just temporary night watchmen guarding an empty building at the edge of a world that stopped caring a long time ago, waiting for the final drop of the blade. The massive cedar wood keyboard shuddered under his dead weight, the dozens of tiny iron hooks rattling violently like wind chimes in a hurricane of blood, as the trap maker hit the floor with a dull, echoing thud that shook the foundations of the room. The heavy cedar wood keyboard shuddered against the cedar wall, dozens of tiny iron hooks rattling like loose teeth in a shattered jaw as the trap maker hit the floorboards with a dull, bone-crushing thud that fractured my nerves into jagged shards. My chest heaved with ragged, freezing breaths that burned like molten iron, my hand still outstretched from the frantic shove that had caught him off balance and sent him sprawling into the dark, bloody corner of the office where death waited. Have you ever stood over an adversary who has just fallen, waiting for them to rise again to tear your throat out, knowing that a single momentary lapse in your vigilance will be your absolute undoing and a one-way ticket to the grave? People talk about victory in a conflict as if it arrives with a clean, triumphant finish line where the bad guy stays down and the hero walks away into sunlight. They imagine themselves breathing a sigh of relief, dropping their guard, and assuming the nightmare is finally over once the physical threat hits the floor. They don't understand the exhausting, paranoid reality of surviving a predator who refuses to die, a monster molded by maximum security cells and cold-blooded slaughter. They don't know what it feels like when your legs shake so hard you can barely stand, your lungs burn for want of clean air, and your mind races with the terrifying certainty that the fall was a momentary inconvenience to a killer who wants to skin you alive. The trap maker didn't stay down for long, his resilience an affront to human biology. Even as his shoulder scraped hard against the base of the wall, tearing skin and fabric, his thick hands were already moving with lethal efficiency, brushing away a cascade of loose brass keys that rained down upon him from the board above like shrapnel. Clink, clatter, clink. Dozens of small, notched metal tags dropped from hooks like heavy metal raindrops, scattering across the floor around his boots and rolling into the shadows beneath filing cabinets, staining wood with fresh grease and copper. He didn't curse. He didn't cry out in pain from the brutal impact. He simply shook his head slightly, clearing frost, blood, and wood dust from his thick hair, and planted his palms flat against the gore-stained floor to push himself back up to a kneeling position with demonic speed. His cold, unblinking eyes locked back onto mine with an intensity that felt heavier than the winter storm raging outside the frosted glass, burning into my soul like hot coals. Think about how fragile our sense of accomplishment really is when we believe we have finally overcome an obstacle that has haunted us for miles through the frozen wasteland. We celebrate early victories, pat ourselves on the back for surviving a close call, and convince ourselves that cleverness has permanently changed the outcome of our story before the blade descends. We forget that true persistence doesn't wear out when it hits a snag, it simply adjusts its grip and keeps moving forward to claim your flesh. Then the man you just knocked down pushes himself back to his feet with a quiet, terrifying smile, and you realize that you haven't won anything at all, you have only managed to anger the machine and seal your own doom in blood. Not bad, kid, the trap maker rasped, his voice smooth and calm as he braced his left hand against the wall and rose slowly to his full height like a waking nightmare. You've got more fight in you than management pays for, but it won't save your skin. He reached down to his belt, his thick fingers brushing against a heavy leather holster where a second tool rested, not a crowbar, but something smaller, darker, sharper, and infinitely more precise for carving bone. I backed away another step, my heel catching the edge of the fallen oak desk where his iron crowbar still remained deeply embedded in the splintered wood like a gaping wound. There was no more time to run from the inevitable slaughter. There was no more furniture to push, no more chains to hook, and no more doors to lock against the encroaching dark. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have freedom to move them, to grip an object, or to reach out for one last defense before the night swallows everything and leaves you bleeding on the floor. How long do you think those fingers will remain your own once the final confrontation begins and the distance between you and the hunter vanishes completely in a red mist? We are all just temporary night watchmen guarding an empty building at the edge of a world that stopped caring, waiting for the executioner's final strike. The trap maker pulled his hand away from his belt, letting a small, heavy object slip between his fingers as he took a slow, deliberate step toward the center of the room to finish what he started. The small, heavy object dangling from the trap maker's gloved fingers did not catch the dim light with a flash of polished brass. It absorbed the shadows like a black hole, matte and dark and ice-cold, radiating an aura of absolute execution. My spine hit the edge of the filing cabinet with a sharp, jarring, bone-fracturing thud, but I couldn't feel the pain over the frantic, deafening hammer of my own pulse tearing my eardrums apart from the inside out as terror choked my throat. Have you ever watched an adversary draw something small and precise, knowing instantly that the scale of the tool changes the entire geometry of your survival into a swift, bloody slaughter? People always talk about lethal threats in terms of grand, sweeping violence, sledgehammers, broadswords, and roaring fires that consume everything in their path. They imagine themselves dodging heavy blows, wrestling for massive weapons, and relying on brute strength to overpower an attacker in the dark. They don't understand the terrifying intimacy of a compact instrument designed solely for quiet, absolute, blood-soaked efficiency. They don't know what it feels like when a killer sets aside the blunt tools of destruction and replaces them with something small enough to fit quietly in the bloody palm of a hand, requiring nothing more than a single, effortless, fatal twitch of a finger to end a life and spill your soul across the floor. The trap maker stopped 4 feet away from me, his breath fogging slightly in the freezing air of the unheated administration office as the blizzard outside battered the wooden siding like a chorus of dying screams. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush his movements, savoring my paralyzed agony. He held the compact pistol, dark-blued steel fitted with a heavy, threaded suppressor, down at his side like an extension of his own malice, swinging it with the casual, unconscious ease of a butcher carrying a cleaver. The crowbar was a mistake, he murmured, his raspy voice cutting cleanly through the howling gale outside the window like a knife through flesh. Too loud. Too clumsy. Leaves too much room for a desperate kid to get lucky with a shove and bleed all over the rug. He tilted his head, his dark, dead eyes studying my frozen, trembling form with a clinical, detached, sadistic curiosity. This is much cleaner, he continued softly, a chill running down my spine. No noise. No structural damage to the resort. And when the spring thaw finally comes around in 2 months, the local sheriff won't have to waste half a day trying to pry a steel bar out of an antique oak desk over your shredded corpse. Think about how small the margins of our existence really are, despite all the grand architecture we build around our lives to make ourselves feel permanent before the Reaper arrives. We construct massive careers, accumulate complicated histories, and surround ourselves with walls, locks, and insurance policies, acting as if our deaths require an elaborate, catastrophic event to match our self-importance. We believe our endings will be cinematic and grand. Then a man steps into a dim room with a pocket-sized piece of machined metal designed to tear flesh, and you realize that all of human history, all of your memories, and all of your tomorrow can be permanently erased in a spray of blood by something no larger than a fountain pen. My eyes darted from his cold, steady gaze down to the suppressed barrel pointed directly toward my chest, ready to rip through my ribs. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to move, to lunge, to tear at his throat, but my muscles were locked tight, paralyzed by the absolute certainty that any movement now would only trigger the inevitable, agonizing end. "Any last entries for the logbook, Richard?" the trap maker asked, his lips curving into a thin, humorless, flesh-tearing smile as he slowly raised his right arm to aim. "Or are you ready to close out the shift in a pool of your own blood? Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of blood pumping through your fingertips and the freedom to curl them into a fist before the bullet shatters them. How long do you think those hands will remain steady when the final choice is stripped away and the room goes completely silent except for the gurgle of your breath? We are all just temporary night watchmen guarding an empty building at the edge of a world that stopped caring a long time ago, waiting for the final executioner's bullet. The trap maker lifted the weapon until it was level with my heart, his cold finger resting lightly against the curved metal of the trigger, waiting for the exact right second to press it home and blow my life away. The heavy, lethal steel barrel of the suppressed pistol did not waver by a single millimeter, held steady by an iron-hard arm trained in decades of quiet, methodical violence, butchery, and cold-blooded execution designed to rip human flesh apart. My back was pressed flat against the freezing, jagged metal of the filing cabinet, my burning lungs screaming for oxygen in the glacial, blood-tainted air of the administration office while the winter blizzard shrieked like a dying animal being brutally torn limb from limb against the frosted glass. Have you ever experienced that strange, surreal, and agonizing moment right before the absolute end, when the frantic panic of survival suddenly dissolves into a vast, heavy, suffocating silence filled with the metallic, copper taste of your own rising blood and torn tissue? People always talk about final seconds as a chaotic blur of screaming, fighting, and desperate flailing against the dark. They imagine themselves going down swinging, roaring defiance into the face of death with a cinematic courage that Hollywood taught them to expect before the blade or bullet falls. They don't understand the profound, humbling, utterly crushing stillness that settles over your paralyzed mind when you finally realize that the fight is over, your bones are about to shatter, and your doomed flesh belongs entirely to the executioner. They don't know what it feels like when the noise of the world fades away into absolute, terrifying nothingness, leaving only the agonizing, heavy sound of your own failing heartbeat slowing down, tick by agonizing tick, like a clock running out of its final drops of lifeblood and oil. The trap maker's finger tightened ever so slightly against the curved metal of the trigger, ready to pierce my heart and scatter my life across the floorboards. He didn't look angry. He didn't look triumphant in his sick slaughter. He looked like a man finishing a tedious, routine chore at the end of a long, blood-soaked workday, ready to lock up the building and walk out into the snow over my freshly mutilated corpse. "Good shift, kid," he whispered over the howling roar of the mountain gale like a death sentence delivered straight from the fiery pits of hell. Think about how foolishly we cling to the illusion that we are the authors of our own stories, writing grand chapters about our ambitions, our secrets, and our tomorrows before the butcher arrives to rip the pen from our hands. We spend years running from our pasts, hiding in remote mountain lodges, and building pathetic barricades out of wood and iron, convinced that we can cheat the final audit and survive the terrifying night. We act as if our fragile existence matters to the vast, empty wilderness surrounding us that hungers eternally for our crushed bones and spilled entrails. Then a man points a small, deadly piece of steel at your chest in an abandoned resort, and you realize that the world never belonged to us at all, but to the shadows, the killers, and the dead. We were just temporary tenants passing through a dark, blood-stained room, waiting for someone to return the key to the board in a pool of raw gore. I closed my eyes tightly to brace for the devastating impact of the high-velocity bullet tearing brutally through my ribs and shredding my organs. Not in fear, but simply to shut out the pale, ghostly light of the storm, leaving behind a sudden, absolute darkness that felt surprisingly peaceful after hours of soul-crushing terror. I listened to the wind violently rattling the cedar siding like skeletal fingers scratching at a coffin lid. I listened to the distant, rhythmic creak of the old pine trees bending under the crushing weight of the snow, ice, and slaughter. And then, across the quiet office, from the wall-mounted key cabinet where hundreds of metal tags hung in silent rows like executed hanged men, a single stray brass key slipped from its iron hook and dropped softly onto the bloody floorboards. Clink. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the breath in your lungs and the strength to move your fingers before the bone shatters and the darkness consumes you. How long before the board is cleared, the lights go out forever, and the office is left completely empty and dripping with viscera for the next watchman to find in the dark? We are all just temporary guards at the edge of a world that wants us brutally dead. The suppressed pistol made a tiny, muffled puff sound that vanished instantly beneath the roaring fury of the blizzard as the lethal lead tore straight through my flesh, destroying my heart. And the dark rushed in to fill the room, consuming my soul completely in an eternal, silent abyss.